Serve, back to you, right? I mean, this is what this game is. If the mainstream media in the U.S. was running with Putin agrees to ceasefire, then they're idiots and they weren't paying any attention to anything that Putin said, or weren't capable of understanding it, or are just lost in their own propaganda. Because what Putin said was the exact opposite. Putin said, I do not agree to this ceasefire. He said, in very polite terms, I agreed to the idea of a ceasefire, but you cooked up this half-baked shit with your proxy Kiev regime under pressure and then tried to present it to us, the side that is winning this conflict, against you and your proxy, as a diktat. We see what you're trying to do. This, Ukraine has agreed, now the ball's in Russia's court. We see that this is diplomatic pressure to try to paint us as the obstacle to peace, right? Every European leader that last week was frothing at the mouth of hating Trump and promising, they had a war summit to spend hundreds of billions of dollars, right, on that was to be magicked out of somewhere. And to create a powerful European army to fight Russia and take back Ukraine and everything, right? It was war. And now suddenly, ceasefire is the best thing. Ball's in Russia's court, right? These European leaders, you don't have to like the Russian president, right? Well, I think you should, but, that's another story. If you don't, what you can at least admit is that he is consistent. Right? What he says he means, he does, right? Not this political and media manipulation games that we see with these Western leaders. So what Putin did is deflect. And I talked about this just last night on a show with the former Sputnik radio host, now host of his own show, Garland Nixon, and we both agreed that Russia's going to say no, but they're going to say it in such a nice, polite, diplomatic way, and then they're going to tag on all their conditions, right? We agree with the idea of a ceasefire is precisely what Putin said, and then he proceeded to punch holes in this, right? You tried to present this half-baked shit to us as a ceasefire, and he just proceeded to ask the questions, right? That make clear what a half-baked, half-assed excuse for a ceasefire this document is, and quite obviously, the Trump team. I mean, it's no question the U.S. hasn't done diplomacy in like 30 years of the unipolar moment, right? Everything is just do what we say, stick, now do what we say, right? I mean, that's the response to everything. Well, Russia has never lost the diplomatic tradition, and the support that the rest of the world has showed Russia by refusing to entertain the Western sanctions war, right? Which, I think correctly is read in the West as kind of we're neutral, go Russia, go. Go Russia, go, right? I mean, that's what they're saying in Africa and Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. But it shows the lack of diplomatic power and ability of the U.S. that they couldn't wrangle the rest of the world. And here we see it on display again. They don't even know how to conduct high-level negotiations like this anymore. The Russians come to a diplomatic negotiations prepared, with experts, with professionals, not political appointees and I don't know, businessmen, who Trump knew from real estate days or whatever like that. So they're being very polite about it all, right? They're not calling out. Putin is simply raising questions. That's the way he does it. The first thing he said is, hello, we just broke through the Kiev regime's occupation of Kursk and Suja, and we literally have thousands of Ukrainian troops trapped who can't escape. Are we just supposed to let them go? after they've been killing Russia. The Western media, of course, hasn't been reporting about this, but they were killing hundreds of Russian citizens in the towns that they occupied, particularly men. Although there's evidence that they, in other places, also killed women and children. Now, I don't think it's quite the scale of the West's other favorite genocide artists in Israel, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham now in Syria, massacring Alawites and Christians and the Druze too, if the Israelis weren't protecting them. But it's bad enough, right? There are definitely dozens and probably hundreds of Russians that couldn't get out before the Kiev regime's military occupation that were then killed, simply, of course, because they're Russians, right? They had some of their best Banderite fascist neo-Nazi units there, and we saw plenty of videos when they first went in. And so what are we just supposed to let them walk out? All right. After all of this, right? Of course, there's no questions about that. And he points out that there's other places on the front line, well, not quite as dramatic as that, but are in analogous situations, right? And then he points out, and during this 30 days, right, we're all in favor of the idea of a ceasefire if it leads to a long-term peace, right? And if they have clear indications that it's leading to a long-term peace, right? Which has actually always been Russia's position. They want a long-term peace. They're not against the ceasefire if they did so. Behind closed doors, I'm sure Putin is going to reiterate all the demands that he made about a ceasefire in June, right? June 14th, even, I believe, where he talked about the withdrawal of the Kiev regime forces from all of the four oblasts, a solid commitment to that they will restore the neutrality to the Ukrainian constitution that the Ukrainian constitution had before the West-backed Maidan Putsch in 2014, that they would return to neutrality, about not firm agreements, but commitments to the demilitarization and the denazification and all of that, right? That Putin made clear that was the requirements for a ceasefire. And they've been saying no ceasefire, unless those conditions are met. But he illustrated these questions by asking the Russian problems by asking other questions. He said, what's going to happen during these 30 days, right? Of course, you can't keep sending them weapons, which is exactly what Trump intended to do, because he returned to them the flow of U.S. military weapons and intelligence just for agreeing to the ceasefire. Right? We're not going to give you a chance to rearm them. So, what's up? And the same thing with conscription, right? He said he used the polite word mobilization, mass, physically forced mass conscription, right? Literally grabbing, as even J.D. Vance in the Oval White House, you're dragging people off the street and physically forcing them into trenches, right? I mean, J.D. Vance outright said what the Western mainstream media, of course, doesn't want to talk about, that Ukrainians, at least, now that the large numbers of the Banderites have perished in the last 3 years of the war, that they don't want the Ukrainian men don't want to fight and die for this regime, and they're having to force them physically under, with press gangs roaming the streets, to do so, such that Ukrainian men are literally afraid to leave their homes and don't, unless they absolutely can avoid it. So he raised the question about arms. He raised the question about mobilization, and then he raised the question about enforcement. What? A ceasefire, who's going to monitor it? Who's going to enforce it? Right? Because these things are standard for, ceasefires, at least as are conducted by serious powers, right? Serious ceasefires. And it's going to be serious. So how's that going to happen? So, and he's punching all these holes in it.
You know much more about military affairs than I do, Mark. Wouldn't stopping military aid and intelligence to Ukraine be one of the more effective ways of enforcing a ceasefire onto Ukraine?
In theory, it might, but we know, at least we've heard, and seems the Russians have actually said the same thing, actually, that Biden pumped so many weapons and so much munitions into Ukraine in the last couple of months of his presidency that they have enough for another good, midsummer, 6 months, something along those grounds. So, I mean, it would certainly limit their ambitions for breaking a ceasefire, right? And what to do after the ceasefire, expired, if it was actually to last 30 days. And let's be frank, why are they asking for a ceasefire now? Both the US and the Kiev regime has, however, grudgingly under pressure agreed to it, because once again they've suffered a catastrophic defeat on the battlefield. We saw this every time, right? With the Minsk 1, Minsk 2, Ilovaisk, the Baltsova, right? We saw it with even with the Istanbul communique, right? It wasn't there were Russian forces threatening Kiev. They had taken all of almost all of South Ukraine. They were, at that time all the way into Kharkov and everything. And suddenly, we'll sit down and peak and discuss peace. And that was the Istanbul communique. And then once they got the weapons guarantees from the West, so psych, we were never going to do that anyway. We're just playing you for time, as Budanov said, right? I know there's people who believe that it was all Boris Johnson that forced Zelensky. No, they never had any intention. They were simply playing for time while they started the conscription. Well, they started, the mobilization, and Russia didn't, and which was a huge mistake on the Russian side, right? Because they were inexplicably far too trusting again after having been betrayed so many times. But Russia, I'm sure, has other demands for a ceasefire, right? Which are probably haven't much changed since Putin's June, laying those out exactly what they had to be, I just mentioned a few minutes ago. But those will be expressed quietly. All he had to do was raise enough questions about the ceasefire to point out that this is some half-baked shit. That's what you get for not doing negotiations with us about the ceasefire the way this should be done, and trying to present us with some type of ceasefire that you and the Kiev regime have cooked up with, and then present it to us as a diktat. And he says, but I'm going to wiggle, and I'm not going to let you paint me as the obstacle to peace, right? We want peace on our terms, right? I mean, that's ultimately, everyone wants peace, right? On their terms, right? The reality is that Russia's winning the war, and if they don't get their terms diplomatically, then they'll just take them. And the caveat there is, if you make us take them, then we'll take a lot more, right? It has progressively been this way all through the course of the conflict. So a lot of people are probably going to be wrongly panicking on the Russian / pro-Russian side on this, and I, like you pointed out, the Western mainstream media initial reaction is completely wrong, but they're going to be listening. Now, this is all caveat. This is what Putin has said while doing a question and answer session with the press during a visit of the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko. and that was extremely casual and obviously in high spirits. Whatever Putin and Lukashenko's relationship has been over the years, and it hasn't always been the best. They know how to sit quietly and shit talk because they were doing it politely, diplomatically, but that's a lot of what they were doing, right? Particularly Lukashenko, right? But that's more his role. So Putin wasn't addressing, as far as the Russian side is concerned, officially. They have not even received the ceasefire proposal, right? Because we don't actually, all we know of what has been said in the press, which is what the Western press. I'm sure that there's probably a lot more there that was not made available to the press, right? That will be presented to Putin, right? And maybe there's a lot of hidden addendums, hidden points that haven't been presented, that the U.S. may not want to make public, that might make it more agreeable to Russia. And if so, if they answer those questions, if they meet their demands, well, then Russia will, of course, they're still going to push more. They're not just going to accept anything that Trump dumps on their desk, right? Certainly not the way it's presented in the media now. And, even if it's a little bit sweeter behind, what is presented to the media, they're still, of course, going to make a lot of demands, because there's no reason for Russia to give to a ceasefire now, right? They're winning, and they've just had a dramatic surge forward in something that Zelensky had invested a lot of political capital on, and was promising that he would trade it back for Ukrainian territory that the Kiev regime feels that is theirs. So that is obviously going to be an issue. And there's another issue that after Zelensky, after Zelensky wasn't in the room during all these negotiations in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia between Trump's people, headed by Witkoff and Mike Waltz. And the Ukrainian side was headed by Zelensky's Grey Cardinal Chief of Staff, Andrei Yermak, who many people in Ukraine believe is the one actually with all the power in the country. But regardless, Zelensky was like hanging around in Jeddah, just chilling. I mean, maybe he was with his hand at the door listening, or at the window, and I could see Mohammed bin Salman just walking through the hallways, looking at Zelensky with his ear pressed to the door or something like that, shaking his head, right? Because obviously the U.S. didn't want, first of all, they had it in Jeddah, not in Ukraine, not in the U.S., not in Europe, right? They obviously wanted Zelensky separated from the discussions. They felt he was not to be invited, right? Because they don't like him. They feel he's an obstacle. There's no question about that after the White House fracas. But they didn't want him. I mean, quite obviously, it was all being radioed into him anyway, but they just didn't want him in the room. Also, they wanted the psychological effect of having it in the same country where Russia is conducting negotiations with the Russians, right? Saying that we're not putting you on in any advantageous status. This isn't a chill White House Oval Office discussion anymore, right? This is negotiations at a high level. Even if the Americans don't really know how to do that, at least they can present the window dressing. But they also obviously wanted Zelensky separated from the Europeans, right? That's why they didn't have it in Europe, someplace that the European leader like Macron or somebody could stick their nose in and interfere in it. And they also obviously wanted the Ukrainian team separated from the Democrats and the neocons in the West, who if it was held in the U.S., that he would be they would be supporting Zelensky in one way or another. They want him separated from all of that. So that's why it was held in Jeddah. But after the Jeddah agreement, right, supposedly after, whatever they did to twist their arms or make them promises or convince them, Zelensky went right on Ukrainian TV, right, in hours afterward, and said that, among other things, we're not giving up any territory. that not Crimea, not Donbass, not Kherson or Zaporozhye. We're not giving up any of that, and we're not going to demilitarize. And I will stay the president through the course of the conflict, however much longer it lasts. So, I mean, it would seem that if the U.S. disagreed with anything that he came out and said afterwards, then they didn't publicly say so, right? There was no public reaction there. So what is Russia to take away from all of that? That this ceasefire will not lead to any long-term peace outcome that Russia would accept. So once again, they're going through the motions here. Quite obviously, part of the motive here is to put diplomatic pressure on Russia by, if you say no, we paint you as the obstacle to peace. And maybe that wouldn't affect China, but they would use it to put the screws to countries like India and Brazil and others that have trade relations with Russia that they haven't given up on. And they would use it in that way, right? I mean, who cares what the Western mainstream media says, right? That's never, that's never going to be favorable to Russia. They're always going to be painted as the aggressors and the obstacle to peace, and the evil empire or a collapsing failed state or whatever. Just never anything positive. But they would use this. Look, I'm not Biden. I didn't start this conflict. Caveat, I had a lot of role in leading up to the preparations for it, but we'll leave that aside. In fact, Trump has even bragged in the Oval Office about being the one to send javelins that destroyed Russian tanks. I mean, he outright bragged about that. There's a lot of people that try to present Trump as some type of peacemaker. He doesn't want people to die. Oh, come on. He just sent 2,000-pound bombs to Israel, for Christ's sake. He's bragging about that. We just passed the anniversary of Trump's assassination of Qasem Soleimani, right, in Iraq, along with a number of Iraqi generals, by the way, as well. So that's all nonsense.
For better or for worse, you had the United States under Trump reach out to Russia, and now you have the United States assuming this role as almost, I wouldn't even say mediator, but almost like dictator in the peace negotiations. What have you made of this?
Obviously, there's all kinds of mixed signals and contradictions coming out, right? Trump presents a ceasefire, and as he announces it, starts the flow of military and intelligence back to Ukraine. That tells Russia that the U.S. isn't serious about peace, right? That's the first thing it tells them, that there are games being played. If it had been part of, if he had not done that, then Russia might take these ceasefire proposals as, a potential that was serious. But I don't even, when you do that, I don't even think that they think Trump is serious, right? They see that as a walk back from the U.S. really wants to end this conflict. You took one step forward and now 2 steps back. Russia is going to try to maneuver through this and try to use this to continue to improve bilateral relations with the U.S., whether that overlaps or not with further Ukrainian negotiations. But they'll also try to use this to start real negotiations, right, as the conflict continues on the ground, because Russia has always wanted to, negotiations to settle this diplomatically on their terms, right? And they've been perfectly clear about what a long complicated process, these types of negotiations. I mean, take a look at the negotiations during the Vietnam War and the Korean War, and even the length of negotiations that Trump himself went through with the Taliban. Right, there was no ceasefire on the ground in Afghanistan while that was going on. So the excuse that there must be a ceasefire in order for serious negotiations to begin is just nonsense, right? Again, more, I want to save lives. Well, that wasn't the case before, so I don't believe it now. It might play well with the rubes. It might play well with the narrative, the media presentation, but let's be serious here. We're not children, and we don't have to pretend that we believe everything or anything that Trump says, right? Because I don't. So Russia's going to try to use this to, what Europe wants out of this is that Putin says "niet" and "fuck niet," and the war continues, and the U.S. has no choice but to continue it. Putin is going to politely say, we agree with the idea of a ceasefire, but let's begin negotiations. And if they begin negotiations on a ceasefire, then they can roll that into negotiations that Russia wants to have about a real long-term settlement on their terms. And effectively what Putin is doing here is trying to send the ball back to their court and see, again, whether the Trump administration is serious about this or whether they're playing games or trying to figure out what I believe is they just don't even know what they're doing, right? I don't think Trump has a plan, right? I think the Trump administration is divided amongst themselves, that Trump doesn't know how to do diplomacy. It's not a New York real estate racket, right? I mean, the art of the deal, come on. Right, this is high diplomacy in geopolitics. He doesn't know what he's doing. I don't think his people know what they're doing. That's why they're floating back and forth. I mean, some people have tried to paint this as some kind of Trumpian 5D chess that he's taking down the deep state while outmaneuvering the Europeans and laying a trap for them, some kind of ridiculous nonsense like that, or that he's got some type of master plan. No, he's just stumbling through this, right? Occam's razor, people. Come on. Maybe he has intentions, that he wants the conflict to come to an end. But is he willing to give the Russia the terms that they want in order to do so? If not, then it doesn't
most
really
important
make
question. It's the most important question.
Well, if not, then it really doesn't make any difference what his intentions are or are not, right? And as I've said again and again, it's all going to be on what does the U.S. do? What does Trump do then when Putin says "niet," right? And Putin just said, "You're so great, "niet." What was that? No, I mean, let's talk. I mean, that's what he said there, right? I mean, that's what's going on. It's not that Russia wouldn't consider a ceasefire. It's just you have to meet all these conditions first, right? And that's what you get for trying to dictate terms.